Aloha, it is Dave Lawrence, and a big mahalo for joining me. Today we hear from nothing short of a percussion monster. His resume is beyond compare, really. Pink Floyd, The Who, Eric Clapton, Roger Waters, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, the historic Arms concerts, Live Aid, numerous other sessions, way too many to mention, tours, events. He's an actor, perhaps best of all, performing in Hawaii. Two very special concerts with Sir Elton John, who he's collaborated with over the course of decades. It is a great pleasure to welcome Ray Cooper. Aloha, Ray.
Aloha. Thank you for having me here. It's a great honor and joy to be here. Thank you.
Well, you are quite welcome, and I know that I've been fortunate over the last several days to get to talk to Ray a few different times on the phone, and some of his Hawaii memories have come up. But for everyone who will be listening to this, and just for the sake of documenting it for history, can you kind of recap some of your experiences, perhaps starting with your earliest experience in Hawaii?
I first came here with Elton, in fact, and I seem to think it was 1973, but it may have been 1975. And it was, we came here to do some concerts, but also to have a holiday. Elton, in his usual generous way, supplied the whole band with a rest period in the most exotic place we could think of, which is Hawaii, of course, which is very beautiful. And it was a glorious rest. We were in the middle of a very long tour, and so this was extremely comforting and wonderful to be here. I'd never been anywhere quite as exotic as this before, and I have wonderful memories of sun and surf and just wonderful hospitality, hospitality. And I wanted to come back, and because it's not easy to get to. But then I got back again in the 80s to see a very dear friend of mine, Mr. George Harrison, who lived on Maui, and we had a couple of weeks together there, which was wonderful. And now I'm back again to play and hopefully make people happy, I hope.
Oh, there's no question that you will. Some of what you said, I've got to sort of put the spotlight back on for a moment. George Harrison's legendary part of his life that was spent living in Hawaii, certainly a big part of folklore around here. Can you just share, what was that like? You came for a couple weeks. Put that in perspective. I'm sure everyone listening is just going through their mind going, what were they doing there for a couple weeks? I mean, that's tantalizing for most fans.
Gardening, basically. That was, George was an avid gardener. He loved gardening. This is why he loved Hawaii so much. He loved the people. He loved the ukulele. He loved the music of Hawaii. But his joy was the fact that you could, as he said, you could put a lolly stick in the ground and it would flower. He just found it such a wonderful, fertile place to work in the soil. And he developed a beautiful, stunning garden. An estate full of wonderful flowers, and it was always his joy. And I knew him for many years, and he was a dear, dear, dear friend. I miss him desperately. But I remember seeing the plans of this wonderful estate that in the early days, before he actually moved here.
Oh, so when it was being built, he sort of had the drawing?
When it was being built, yeah. And it was just such a wonderful present from him to me to be able to come and see the estate, which is stunning, and it's a tribute to him. As in fact, all of his properties have this wonderful signature of his gardening abilities.
They got to take on his gardening persona, if you will. So, and a trip like that was really nothing but friendship taking place. You were that close to him. You spend 2 weeks here doing nothing but gardening.
Absolutely. Well, we spent many weeks, many places, but this was always his favourite place. This was the place that, any chance he had to get back to, he would come to Maui, and he was always talking about Maui.
You are a fitting guy to pay some tribute to him because, of course, Concert for George was something that, if you could talk a little bit about your role, it meant a lot to me. Every Beatle has meant a lot to different people. George was really a Beatle who meant the most to me, I guess because he was the quiet guy. There was something about his personality, and even though his loss was something we could see coming, it was really terrible when it came, and you helped pay tribute in such a moving way. Can you share some memories of getting that to happen and what it was like?
Well, the concert for George, which was extremely sad, something none of us involved really wanted to do, in the sense of we wanted George there. But having said that, it was an extraordinary event, and from Monty Python, who were active at the concert, Eric Clapton, everybody, all these wonderful players, Ringo, Paul, and a host of other friends and family. There was a feeling which everybody shared, of the most intense love on the stage. You know, we've all been on stages, all of us had been many performances, but everybody came off of that particular stage saying that they'd never felt anything like that before, ever. And it was a concert that in many ways we didn't want to finish, because he was such a comfort, being his soul and spirit was there. And it was a genuine rejoicing of his life and work, but it was still very painful to do. And then I had the privilege, but also the painful task of being with it for another year, because I was one of the producers, along with Mrs. Harrison and a wonderful gentleman called John Kamen. And so I had to sit in the cutting rooms for another year watching this material, which was beautiful but also very painful. And it was difficult to watch, and sometimes it's still difficult to talk about it, because it was a very, very, very moving event, and I think George would have been pleased with it.
It's an enduring fight. A few of the Isn't It a Pity? I'm just going to comment on a couple of the ones, because when you talk about moving, I cried. The first time I saw it, it was such a deeply, and it's hard to talk about it without getting somewhat choked up, but especially now that Billy's gone. But Isn't It a Pity is a moving one, and then his version, I guess it was him on lead vocals with the My Sweet Lord, which was
unbelievable. Billy was, Billy was a genius musician, and he loved George, and George loved Billy very much. If you watch Concert for Bangladesh, and Billy jumps up, because George had voice problems at that point, because he was working so hard for that concert. He sort of let his health sink a bit, and Billy understood that, and Billy comes under his voice all the time, supporting it. It's just so moving. And he really loved Billy, and Billy, I say, Billy's love for George comes through in that concert. And then we lost Billy, which was awful. Jim Capaldi, we lost Jim, and there's a lot of people out there that are not with us. And Michael Kamen, who was also the conductor.
That's right.
Michael's gone.
Legendary conductor
And composer, wonderful man, another dear friend, who there were too many missing now, and sadly.
Were you close to Billy? Was he a close friend?
Yeah, because we'd work with George. I was very lucky and very privileged, as I've been in most of my active creative life. It's all just been luck, and
yes,
it really has. I met George as a Beatle, and we became friends, which was the guitar player and the percussion player, but it worked. And he was such a joy, and George had a sort of a fraternity of people that he used, and Billy was one of them, of course, and I was very lucky to be one of them too. I was the percussionist, Jim Keltner was the drummer, and how wonderful he is, and Billy was, when available, was the keyboard player, and it just went on, and we were great friends and great times down at the Apple Studios in Savile Row, and then George at Friar Park when he built his own studio in the house. Joyous times, really, and again, joyous but also painful, because you miss them, But we had them, and we did that stuff, which was great. Great music.
As I said when I introduced you, your resume is it's breathtaking. How did your circle, your life of Ray Cooper, first intersect with the Beatles? What led that to happen? And if you can, just because you've been so lucid with your memories, if there's a particular memory of first coming into their presence.
Well, it actually in the 60s and the 70s, and to a certain extent to the 80s, it started to change then. I was a session musician, a studio player, and we were all very busy in those days. We were doing 3 studio sessions a day, every day virtually, and we didn't know where we were. We would get a time, and maybe as a percussion player I'd get some instruments I would be needed to play, but I didn't know who I was going to play for. It was as wonderful and as interesting as that. So you had to be able to read very, very well, because you could be Andre Previn in the morning, you could be with Cilla Black in the afternoon, and a reggae in the evening. You didn't know.
Ultimate versatility was required.
Absolutely. And just literally one of these sessions took me, and I met the Fab Four. It was one of those situations, and then, as I say, Apple was the studio, so George said, "Well, you must come." So I did all the sort of Dark Horse records, or a lot of them, not all of them, a lot of them, and became a part of George's part of Apple, and Paul had his part of it, which I also was very privileged and lucky to do some of the Wings stuff. And Live and Let Die, the film with Paul, he was always very sweet with me, and some of Ringo's stuff, and then of course John as well, which was wonderful. We did some wonderful stuff with John.
I didn't know that you had. You have worked with all. Fill me in on the John experiences of actual working together.
Well, John was an extraordinary man. There's no question about that. Interesting, wonderfully dangerous, and I mean wonderfully, because he was so.
Irreverent.
Wonderfully. Exactly. I was searching for the word, and you, wonderful stuff. Anyway, but he came on the road with Elton for a year almost, and which was a very interesting time. And I knew him anyway, so we had some wonderful times. And then in that year we did we recorded Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds for Elton, but he also did Whatever Gets You Through the Night, which I'm on, and that was the reason, of course, the very famous reason. Elton said, "Well, we'll do this session, and if it goes to number one, you have to play live with us," and which is what happened, and that's why Madison Square Garden happened. And I think it may have been, sadly and awfully, his last live performance, actually, because I think after that it was studio work. I don't think he played live again after.
From 75 to 80, right?
And that concert was one of the, again, like Concert for George, was but for different reasons. It was one of the most moving experiences again, because John came on, there was rumours that he would be there, but nobody really knew. And when he came on, it was at least 10 to 12 minutes before anybody could play. The kids just went crazy. The place lit up. The heat from the lighters and the matches was extraordinary. John was astonished. He had no idea, genuinely, as he was very humble in many ways. He had no idea that this would be the response, and it was incredibly moving. I was actually in tears. It was extraordinary. And then he just did his thing. It was wonderful. It was a great night, one I'll never ever forget.
Oh, I love it. It's and luckily we have the video, because you're like lost in the moment there. It's so precious. You can tell you can remember it well. Elton John is who's brought you, fortunately for us, back to Hawaii, and you have a long history with him. How did you first get to have Sir Elton John, long before he was a Sir, become part of your life?
Well, again, it was we've known each other for a long time, and we've for many years. And we were both session musicians, studio musicians, and I would turn up on sessions, and Elton would be backing vocal or playing piano, and Long John Baldry or sessions or whatever it was. And I knew him in those days. And then one day I got a call from, and I knew him by his prior name, and I got a call by one of the session fixers, the guys that ring you up and tell you where to go, to turn up at a Dick James studio where I was going to be recording with Elton John. And I didn't know who Elton John was. So I turned up, and it was the man I knew by his prior name, which I won't mention now because he doesn't like it, and quite right, because he's Elton John. He's Sir Elton John, which is wonderful. And what a glorious surprise. And he was always very, very kind to me, and always very sweet. Now, I was a session musician. I was working with Johnny Danquith, the great jazz musician, and Cleo Lane, and doing other things. I was in a group called Blue Mink, which was it was the sort of core of the English session players. Herbie Flowers, the great bass player who did Walk on the Wild Side. Barry Morgan, who sadly another who's passed on, a wonderful drummer who did all of Elton's early stuff, Take Me to the Pilot and all that. That was Barry on drums.
And you were all together in sort of like a session supergroup.
Well, we decided that we should do it for ourselves occasionally, so we formed a group called Blue Mink, which was Roger Cook and Madeleine Bell as well. They were the two singers. And we had a couple of hits, and anyway, and time was moving on, and Elton rang me. And he was successful then, and I with his big shoes and wonderful glasses and everything. And I didn't know, and I couldn't imagine. I went to see the band. I went to see the show, and there was Nigel, wonderful Nigel Olsen, with his driving gloves and his long hair, and David Johnson with his long blonde. And I've always looked very much like I look now, so I couldn't imagine how I could possibly fit in. And Elton was very persuasive and very sweet. And I said, well, look, the only way I can do this is you're on tour now. I think it was Bristol I went to see the concert. I said, well, I'll come on stage the next night, and whatever happens, we'll see what happens. So I went, literally with no rehearsals, I went on stage. I knew the material, some of it anyway. I went on stage the next night in Liverpool, I think it was, and I never looked back. My hands all split because I was playing an acoustic instrument. I've never really played with such a sound of electric before, but it was wonderful. And then it was like joining the Navy. I sort of toured the world then, and it was a ticket to ride, which has always been joyous. And we've been apart for us in many periods of our lives. We did the two-man show first in 1978 for 1 week at the Rainbow Theatre in London, and for charity. And it was very wonderful because he rang me and said, I'm coming out of retirement, because he'd retired in 1976. He'd sort of said he was not going to work anymore, which was a big shock to everybody. And he rang me and said, I want to come out of retirement. And I thought he wanted to put the band back together again. But he said, no, I want to do a concert with you, which was very brave of him, because no one had ever done anything like that. But it appealed to me, it made sense as well. It sort of freed him up. It sort of severed the umbilical cord.
Oh, it was very pioneering.
Very pioneering, yeah. And so we did some rehearsal, and we did this 1 week at the Rainbow, and which followed 1979. We did a whole year. We went to Moscow and Leningrad, and we did the first live performance to England from Moscow, and Israel. We went all over the place. Australia. It was a wonderful, wonderful tour, And then Elton went back to, I think he was living in France at that point. And George rang me, George Harrison, bless him, and said, what are you doing now? And I said, well, not very much. And he said, well, I used to be in the theatre. I wasn't particularly good at it, but I love the theatre. And he said, well, you know all these theatre people. I think I've got a film company. Why don't you be me in the office? Which is very sweet of him. So Handmade Films had been founded, and so I came at the tail end of Life of Brian, and started and developed into the head of production and development. And I was there for 11 years. We made 23 feature films, and we had some fun and we had some pain, but the fun part was meeting Monty Python and making dear friends with all of them, especially Terry Gilliam and Michael Palin, who are dear, dear friends.
And the whole avenue that has come because of the Terry Gilliam.
And because of, working on all of Terry's films subsequent to that, which has been great fun, and all because of George. All the doors have always opened. First, because of music, because music's always been the key to the door, and it's led me through wonderful pathways. And George was one of those people that if he knew you had a passion, and if it was good passion, somehow your dream would come true.
That's how he was as a friend in terms of trying to help your dreams come true.
Yes, he would make sure they came true. He would have availed himself to help see it come true. Yeah, he did it for so many people, anonymously, quietly, always in a wonderful, sweet way. but he had to believe in your passion. He had to believe that you believed in your passion.
You yourself have been part of giving, and as I've told you, when the first encounter I've had with who is Ray Cooper was when I was a little boy, and you were part of giving as the ARMS concerts. I believe it's active research into multiple sclerosis, based around Kenny Lane, who had Ronnie Lane from the Faces.
Yeah.
Who had MS, and you did this, remarkable thing that, there were so many people on stage together, Jimmy Page, Eric Clapton, Bill Wyman, Paul Rogers, so many folks were at that. Share some memories for how you came to be a part of that, and some of the spirit of camaraderie which must have existed with all of you coming together.
Well, I think it was Glyn Johns who started that, and I think, in fact, if one is... it was George Harrison who really, with the concert for Bangladesh, who started the whole thing, including the inspiration to Live Aid. I think Bob Geldof said that at the time. So the idea of musicians giving back is a very wonderful one, and we should all do that as much as we possibly can. Because we have that language, we have a universal language which we can use appropriately. So Glyn Johns had the idea, I'm sure it was Glyn, to do concerts to raise money to help Ronnie, but also to help multiple sclerosis sufferers. And so we got together, and Glyn made all the phone calls, and I don't know how he got these people together, but he got a coterie of the finest musicians. Never before had the great rock and roll heroes, guitar players, ever been on stage together. It was extraordinary. See Eric and Jeff Beck, and it was extraordinary. And again, like Concert for George, there was this feeling that the egos were left at the door, and there was work to do, and good work to do, and we had, so that, and that's how it should be. Musicians share this language, and they should share that generosity too. So it was an incredible concert. Jimmy Page, which was astonishing. Jimmy wasn't, but yeah, it was an interesting concert. I've never done anything quite like it before. Charlie Watts, right. Bill Wyman. I'm just thinking all the names. Kenny Jones. It was
Simon Phillips. I remember
the wonderful Simon Phillips. Extraordinary. Yes, extraordinary.
Let's use that as an avenue to talk drummers, because I could sit here with you forever, and I know you've got a show to do with Elton John. I'm actually a drummer, and two things. My mom has multiple sclerosis, so that's one reason why I've always had a tighter bond with that concert. And I always remember you on those timpanis up there just going crazy. But on drummers, I'm going to tell you who my two favorite drummers are, and I always do this whenever I get the opportunity to speak with a legendary drummer or percussionist. I'd love you to critique them if you don't mind. Is that all right?
Well, I can't critique anybody, but because my heart goes out to anybody that gets up on a platform and plays an instrument. And I think they're all joyous, believe me. But who are your favorites?
My two favorites are, and they're just about tied. But John Bonham has a slight lead, and he would be my all-time greatest in influence and inspiration and favorite sound as a drummer. And then right behind him, a very close second, the late great Cozy Powell.
Oh, Cozy Powell, yeah. We shared a dentist. It's true. That was interesting. Yeah. John was extraordinary drummer, and he was particularly wonderful about the sound, because I remember hearing him bellow out one day to the sound man in a studio where they were rehearsing. He wanted his bass drum to sound like cannons, and they did, and he was wonderful. The energy and the command that he had over those instruments and that band, it was extraordinary. He was the driving power behind.
He grooved so hard.
Absolutely. It's a one-man groove machine. Yes. Yeah, they're all wonderful. We were talking about Jim Keltner earlier. Jim is so wonderfully laid back and does wonderful things, small things, delicate things. He's like a colorist. And that's usually not usually, but it's sometimes the job of the percussionist to be the colorist, because we don't have to play rhythm all the time.
You're a real colorist.
Well, you're very kind. You're very, very kind. I try to be. I try to sort of play to all sorts of aspects of a song, to the lyrical content, to the rhythmic content, and try and support, underscore the libretto, if you like. Yeah, it's and I get it right sometimes, and I get it wrong a lot of times.
Well, that's why I wanted you to see what you thought of, because the kind of drummers those two guys are really like more like steamroller kind of drummers. They're so different than Color in so many ways.
They're the engine department. They're the real. They drive things along, and it's extraordinary to be a part of it. You know, and I've been lucky to work with a few of those guys. And you just sit back on their beat. You just sit there and you just play. It's just extraordinary.
Any cozy memory?
Cozy, well, only out of the fact that we shared a dentist together. No, he was a wonderful drummer. Yeah, and again, sadly missed. Oh God, it's terrible talking about these lovely men, both Cozy, yeah, and John, yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Well, just two guys that I had to, see where your head was at. Before I let you go, if you were to think about, you've been fortunate to work with some of music's most important stars, most vital stars, crucial rock artists. Looking back, if you could just say a few of the people you thought are the highlights that you could never live without, but that is, on the flip side, are there a few artists left that you really aspire to? Just as an example, I'm just throwing one out. Like if you looked at B.B. King and said, man, I'd really like to, or somebody, are there a few cats who you can throw on the opposite side? So a few of the cats who are the most satisfying experiences, and a few of the cats you'd really like to work with.
It's interesting because I'm so old these days, but the joy for me was because I actually played in symphony orchestras too. So many years ago, when I was a young man, I actually worked with Sir John Barbaroli. So he has to be a hero. I only did one concert with him, but that was an extraordinary. And I worked with Carlo Maria Giulini, who was an extraordinary conductor. And then I suppose I tended to sort of be intrigued by musicians that had made bridge building, that had gone from one thing to another thing seamlessly. I mean, George, one of the most moving obituaries of George Harrison was by Philip Glass, which was a surprise to everybody, because Philip stated that George had been a huge inspiration to him through Indian music, and also his eclectic philosophy of music. So it's that sharing of and not being. I love musicians that are good, obviously very good at what they do, but are also very interested in what everybody else is up to, and are interested in making connections with other musicians to explore. And I think that's, for me, sadly, what the business doesn't promote as a business. It doesn't promote that we talk, we feed and source from each other, and that's very, very important. Feeding and sourcing throughout the arts. I think there are two art forms left where that happens, because it's to make a film. You have a wonderful collection of artists and writers, and everybody comes together to make a piece of celluloid. And opera, well, you have the same thing, including the moving image now. It's usually used as backdrops now. The rest are sort of fragmented,
Great way of looking at it.
Well, very kind. But I've always been inspired by, to answer your question, inspired by musicians that have that broad look. And I've been very lucky, because of my travels, to meet such wonderful musicians as Pinker Zuckerman, who, we forget these guys are brought up on rock and roll, although they're wonderful, the most wonderful musicians for classical music, but they also have that beat,
that edge,
yes. Daniel Barenboim, Isaac Perlman, these are all guys, Simon Rattle, they're all out there. They're all listening to rock and roll and jazz and everything else. The first generations, really, to have that, I think, really, have that background, as well as being virtuoso on their instruments and everything else. So, yeah, I just, love meeting people like that, love working with them and collaborating with them, and hopefully bringing something to the table. But normally I take most of it away, I have to say.
Well, we're fortunate to have you here, and I'm looking forward to both of the shows. And I just have to thank you very much for taking some time to speak with me. The percussion legend, Ray Cooper, thank you very, very much.
You're very, very kind. I'm very honoured and privileged to be here. It's a very, very, very beautiful part of the world. Thank you very much indeed. Aloha.
It was a pleasure. Aloha to you.